If you work hard enough, if you get the right degrees, if you speak the right way, and if you make enough money, you can buy your way out of racism. That is the lie they sell us. That is the American dream they package and feed to Black families in this country. They tell us that if we climb high enough up the socioeconomic ladder, the color of our skin will stop mattering, and the size of our bank accounts will shield us from the hatred of the world. My name is Tiana. I am 55 years old. I am a senior architectural partner at a major commercial firm. My husband Malik is a cardiothoracic surgeon who has saved countless lives. Together, we did everything right. We played by all of society's rules. We worked 80-hour weeks, we paid our taxes, we built a beautiful life, and we thought we had finally earned the ultimate prize, safety. We were wrong. Dead wrong. I am sitting here in my study today, speaking to Marcus's archive, because I need to shatter that illusion for anyone watching. I need you to understand that wealth does not buy a Black family immunity from white supremacy. In fact, sometimes it just makes you a bigger target. Our nightmare began in the spring of 2021, March 12th to be exact. Malik had just been promoted to the head of surgery at St. Luke's Medical Center. We decided it was time to move closer to the hospital and give our 15-year-old son Jaden the kind of life we never had growing up. We found our dream home in a place called Oakwood Hills. Oakwood Hills was the epitome of affluent suburban perfection. It was heavily gated. The streets were lined with centuries-old oak trees, the lawns were expansive and immaculately manicured, and the neighborhood boasted its own private tennis courts and a community clubhouse. It was quiet, it was pristine, and it was entirely, overwhelmingly white. When we closed on the house, we were the only Black family in a community of 140 custom-built estates. But we were optimistic. We told ourselves that we were moving into a neighborhood of educated, sophisticated professionals. We thought our degrees and our professions would be our armor. The reality of our situation didn't announce itself with burning crosses or racial slurs spray-painted on our garage doors. Modern, upper-class racism doesn't work like that. It is insidious. It is polite. It is a slow, suffocating gaslighting that makes you question your own sanity. It started the very week we moved in. Two of our neighbors, women named Dana and Opal, came over to introduce themselves. They brought a bottle of wine. On the surface, it was a perfectly lovely gesture, but the conversation felt like an interrogation disguised as small talk. Dana, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, looked around our foyer and asked, "So, what exactly do you do to afford a place like this?" When Malik explained that he was the head of surgery at St. Luke's, the shock on their faces was palpable. They didn't say congratulations. Opal just raised an eyebrow and said, "Oh, wow, they must really be pushing for diversity over there these days." I remember freezing. I remember the immediate tightness in my chest. It was a microaggression, a tiny paper cut of a comment designed to remind us that they didn't believe we truly belonged there on our own merit. But Malik just smiled politely and changed the subject. We wanted to keep the peace. We wanted to fit in. That was our first mistake. By May of 2021, the polite inquiry stopped and the surveillance began. That is when we officially crossed paths with Meredith. Meredith was the president of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. She had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, and she ruled it like it was her own personal fiefdom. Meredith didn't wear a white hood. She wore cashmere sweaters and carried a clipboard. Our first real encounter with her happened when we hired a landscaping crew to put in a new garden in our backyard. The foreman of the crew was a Black man named Curtis. Curtis had been working on our property for maybe 2 hours when Meredith's white Mercedes SUV slowly rolled to a stop at the edge of our driveway. She didn't come to my front door to speak to me. She marched straight onto my grass, bypassed Jaden, who was shooting hoops in the driveway, and confronted Curtis. She demanded to see his work permits. She demanded to know who authorized him to be inside the gates of Oakwood Hills. She spoke to this grown, hard-working man as if he were a criminal trespassing on sacred ground. I walked outside just in time to hear her threaten to call the police on him. I stepped between them. I introduced myself, maintaining a perfectly calm, professional tone, and explained that Curtis was my contractor. Meredith looked me up and down. She didn't apologize to Curtis. She just looked at me with cold, dead eyes and said, "We have very strict standards in Oakwood Hills, Tiana. We like to know who is wandering around our homes. You need to make sure your people aren't loitering. My people." The implication hung in the air like toxic smoke. From that day forward, Meredith made it her personal mission to remind us that we were intruders in her white utopia. The weapon she chose to use against us was the Homeowners Association rulebook. If our trash cans were left at the curb for 15 minutes past the 6 p.m. deadline, we received a formal citation and a $50 fine in the mail the very next morning. Meanwhile, our white neighbor 3 doors down left his bins out for 3 days straight while on vacation, and nothing happened. When Malik parked his car in our own driveway instead of inside the garage, because he was rushing inside to grab a file for an emergency surgery, we received a $200 fine for unsightly vehicle display. Meredith drove past our house slowly, multiple times a day. We were being policed. We were being hunted in our own sanctuary. The psychological toll it took on my marriage was devastating. Malik, a man who literally held human hearts in his hands every day, would come home from 12-hour shifts and anxiously check the height of our grass with a tape measure, terrified of giving them another excuse to fine us. I started having insomnia. I couldn't look out my own front windows without feeling a spike of pure adrenaline and fear. But the fines and the surveillance were just the beginning. The true nightmare, the moment that forever shattered my sense of safety, happened on the 4th of July weekend. Our son Jaden was a straight-A student. He played the cello. He was quiet, respectful, and kind. We had specifically bought a house with a community pool so Jaden could enjoy his summer. That Saturday afternoon, Jaden invited 2 of his friends over from his old high school. Both of them were young black boys. They grabbed their towels and walked down to the community clubhouse to go swimming. Malik and I stayed back at the house to prepare lunch. 30 minutes later, my cell phone rang. It was Jaden. He wasn't crying, but his voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand him. He just kept saying, "Mom, come to the pool. Please come to the pool. They have police here." Malik and I sprinted down the street. I didn't even put shoes on. My bare feet hit the scorching pavement, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break them. Every mother of a black son in America lives with a latent, humming terror in the back of her mind. You know the statistics. You know the news stories. And in that moment, running down the manicured sidewalks of Oakwood Hills, my worst nightmare was coming true. When we arrived at the pool gates, the scene made my blood run cold. Jaden and his 2 friends were standing dripping wet in their swim trunks, shivering in the summer heat, backed up against a chain-link fence. Standing 10 feet in front of them, blocking the exit, was Meredith. And standing next to Meredith was a uniformed police officer. I pushed through the gate. I grabbed Jaden and pulled him behind me. I demanded to know what was going on. Meredith stood there, her arms crossed, looking incredibly smug. She looked at the police officer, a man whose name tag read Vance, and said, "These boys refuse to show me their neighborhood identification cards. They are trespassing, and they were behaving aggressively when I asked them to leave." It was a bold-faced lie. Jaden had his community pool key fob right there in his towel. He had swiped it to get them through the gate, but Meredith saw 3 black teenagers laughing and swimming in her pool, and her immediate instinct was to weaponize the police against them. Officer Vance looked uncomfortable, but he still turned to my husband and asked for our IDs to verify residency. Malik is a proud man, a brilliant man, but in that moment, he had to swallow every ounce of his pride, pull out his driver's license, and prove to a police officer that he had the right to stand in the neighborhood he paid $1 million to live in. I looked at Jaden's friends. They were terrified. They were just children trying to swim on a holiday weekend, and they were being treated like dangerous criminals. I turned to Meredith. I didn't scream. I didn't give her the angry black woman stereotype she was so desperately trying to provoke. I lowered my voice, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "You are a wicked, empty woman, and you will never ever terrorize my child again." We took the boys home. Jaden didn't speak for 2 days. He refused to go back to the pool for the rest of the summer. He started asking us if we could move. The safe haven we had broken our backs to provide for him had become his prison. After the pool incident, the covert racism turned into open, hostile warfare. Meredith convened a special meeting of the HOA board. They passed a new, highly specific bylaw stating that unregistered guests were no longer allowed to use community amenities. A rule clearly designed to keep Jaden from ever bringing his black friends around again. When winter came, our mailbox was repeatedly vandalized. Someone smashed it with a baseball bat 3 times in 1 month. We called the local police, but they always claimed there was insufficient evidence to investigate, despite the fact that Oakwood Hills had security cameras at every gate. The breaking point, the night that forced us to realize we were in actual physical danger, happened in February of 2022. It was 1 a.m. It was freezing cold, snowing heavily. Malik had just gotten paged by the hospital for an emergency heart transplant. He threw on his winter coat, grabbed his medical bag, and walked out the front door to his car parked in our driveway. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee to stay awake until he called to say he arrived safely. Suddenly, the kitchen was bathed in flashing red and blue lights. I dropped the mug. It shattered on the floor. I ran to the front window. 2 police cruisers were parked at steep angles, blocking our driveway. 3 officers had their doors open, hiding behind them, and their guns, their service weapons, were drawn and pointed directly at my husband. Malik was standing in the snow, his hands raised high in the air, his medical bag dropped at his feet. I threw open the front door and ran out into the freezing cold in my pajamas, screaming at the top of my lungs. "He lives here! He's a doctor! He is my husband!" The officers yelled at me to get back inside. I refused. I stood in front of Malik. I would have taken a bullet for him, right there on the concrete. Slowly, the officers lowered their weapons. They approached us, hands hovering over their holsters. The commanding officer asked Malik for his ID. When Malik slowly pulled out his hospital badge and his driver's license, the officers finally relaxed. I asked them, through my own hyperventilation, why they were there. The officer looked at the ground, clearly embarrassed. He said, "We received a 911 call from a neighbor. They reported a suspicious, unidentified male prowling around the vehicles in this driveway. They said they thought he was armed. Someone in Oakwood Hills had looked out their window, saw a black man in a heavy winter coat walking to a car in his own driveway, and called the police, claiming he was armed. They tried to get my husband killed. We didn't sleep that night. We sat at the kitchen table, holding hands, trembling. We realized that all the money in the world, all the degrees on our walls, couldn't protect us from the lethal danger of white paranoia. We decided to fight back. We didn't just pack up and run. We hired one of the most ruthless civil rights attorneys in the state. We filed a massive federal lawsuit against the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association, Meredith personally, and several John Doe neighbors for racial discrimination, targeted harassment, and violation of the Fair Housing Act. During the discovery phase of the lawsuit, our lawyers subpoenaed the HOA board's private email servers. What they found was horrifying. There were dozens of emails between Meredith and other board members explicitly discussing how to make things difficult for our family so we would get the message and leave. They referred to Jaden and his friends as thugs. They openly discussed calling the police on Jaden just to establish a documented pattern of police presence at our address. It was a coordinated, documented conspiracy of racism. When the emails were entered into public court records, the local media got hold of them. The story exploded. The pristine reputation of Oakwood Hills was dragged through the mud on national television. Meredith was forced to resign in absolute disgrace. Several of the board members who participated in the email chain were fired from their corporate jobs when the news broke. The HOA's insurance company panicked and forced them to settle the lawsuit with us for an undisclosed, incredibly large sum of money. We won the legal battle. We got justice on paper. But a few months later, we still put a for sale sign in the front yard. Because justice doesn't erase trauma. A settlement check doesn't make Jaden forget the sight of a police officer confronting him at a swimming pool. It doesn't make Malik forget the terror of staring down the barrel of a loaded gun in his own driveway. It doesn't give me back the countless nights of sleep I lost, terrified of my own neighbors. We sold the house to a white family and moved closer to the city, to a diverse, vibrant neighborhood where we don't have to justify our existence every time we check the mail. I am telling this story because the world needs to understand that racism is not a relic of the past. It is alive, it is well, and it is living in the most affluent, educated zip codes in America. It hides behind HOA bylaws, neighborhood watch apps, and polite smiles. If you are a white person watching this, and you live in a predominantly white neighborhood, putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your front yard is not enough. You have to actively police your own communities. You have to speak up when you see a neighbor harassing a Black contractor. You have to challenge the subtle racist assumptions made at your neighborhood block parties. You have to do the work. And to my Black brothers and sisters out there, navigating these spaces, trust your instincts. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. The gaslighting is real. Protect your peace, protect your children, and never ever let anyone make you feel like you have to apologize for taking up space in a room you earned the right to be in. We survived Oakwood Hills, but we shouldn't have had to. No one should.